Wow. Okay, you've really outdone yourself this time, seriously. This stack of sources, incredible. Tweets from journalists, like right there in the thick of it. Analysts breaking down global power plays, even some whispers of like seriously shady international dealings. I feel like we're going deep, uncovering the real stories beneath the headlines, wouldn't you say?
Totally. It really is like piecing together a puzzle. you know? Finding those connections that maybe, just maybe, the mainstream news might be missing.
And that's what we're here for. We don't just want to recap the news, right? No, we're here to unearth those intriguing and maybe even like those overlooked connections. It's like connecting the dots that others might miss. And with all this talk of, well, global power shifts and really like what even is truth these days, we're better to start than the global stage, you know?
Right. And things are, well, they're moving fast over in Syria.
And speaking of Syria, Jana Musa, she's been reporting from inside Syria, I mean, like, actually in the country since 2011. She has this Twitter thread that has everyone talking. She really doesn't hold back on what could happen, the fallout, if the Syrian regime collapses.
Yeah, it's a serious assessment, especially given, her experience actually being there. I think one of the most alarming things she brings up is, well, the potential rise of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, which the U.S., it's designated as a terrorist organization.
Yeah.
And if they gain control, it could really destabilize the entire region.
It's a domino effect, isn't it? And not just within Syria itself. Musa, she also talks about, the potential for this huge wave of refugees fleeing, mostly minorities. They fear what would happen if HTS takes over.
Exactly. And think about the strain on neighboring countries,
Yeah.
like Lebanon and Jordan, right? They're already dealing with so much. It could be a humanitarian crisis.
Yeah.
Like a massive one. And we can't forget, the ripple effects would go even further. It could even destabilize Europe as people seek refuge.
Yeah. And then there are the major players, right? Turkey, Russia, Israel, and Iran, each with their own interests. How do you see this playing out for them?
Well, Turkey, they've been supporting anti-Assad forces, so, they might see this as kind of a chance to gain more influence, right? Maybe even at Russia's expense. Russia, well, obviously losing an ally like that, and then their naval base in Tartus, that would be a major strategic loss for them.
And for Israel?
It's complicated. On one hand, if the Syrian regime collapses, it could disrupt Iran's supply lines to Hezbollah in Lebanon, which, that would definitely weaken them. But then on the other hand, it creates this power vacuum, and who knows, even more extreme groups could take advantage of that, which is a risk for everyone, really.
So much uncertainty. And Iran, what's at stake for them?
For them, losing Syria as an ally would be a huge setback to everything they're trying to do in the region, their influence, everything. It would weaken their position significantly in this ongoing power struggle in the Middle East.
It really does make you realize how connected everything is. One event, in Syria could completely reshape the geopolitical landscape. And speaking of global influence, our next thread, well, this one takes us to Finland. And from what I've seen, pro-Kremlin sentiment there is, well, it's not having a good time.
You could say that. Pekka Kallioniemi, a Finnish journalist, he actually describes it as like a comedy routine these days. Seriously. It's like the Vatnik Club. This term for the strong pro-Kremlin supporters, they've lost their, swagger, especially since the invasion of Ukraine.
It's fascinating, really, how a global event like that can shift things, even in, a country like Finland, seemingly so far away. So who are these Vatniks and what are they up to? So
Kallioniemi, he points to these figures like Johan Beckman, he's actually a Russian citizen now, and Janis Putkonen. They're still pushing those pro-Kremlin narratives, but people are starting to see them as kind of irrelevant. Like
a band, right? Like a band past their prime, playing the same old tunes to, fewer and fewer fans.
Exactly. And Kallioniemi, he highlights some ridiculous situations involving this group.
Yeah.
It really shows how irrelevant they're becoming.
Okay, I have to hear this. Give me an example.
All right, so there's this story about Panu Hutanen. He got removed from a literary festival for filming a journalist, Jessica Arayo. And then he claimed he was seriously hurt, even made this makeshift tourniquet for his leg, saying he was injured. But I don't know, it all seemed a bit much.
A bit of a drama queen, maybe. But how does this tie back to Johan Beckman and the whole pro-Kremlin scene?
Well, Kallioniemi, he connects them through this Toimita Jelvito. It's supposed to be a journalist association founded by Beckman. But the funny thing is, their press passes, They use Finnish postal tracking codes as the barcodes.
You're kidding, right? Postal codes on press passes, that's almost too much.
It really highlights, the lack of credibility, right? But Kalianiemi's point is, even these kind of absurd incidents, they can feed into Russia's propaganda machine.
By, distracting people and, I guess, making people distrust real journalism.
Exactly. It's about muddying the waters, making it harder to tell what's real and what's not. That brings us to another thread. This was from Annika Leister. He's an investigative journalist, and it takes us to a secret meeting in Sochi, Russia.
A secret meeting? Okay, I'm in. Who's involved?
So Leister, she uncovered this meeting. It was very hush-hush between Maximilian Krah, a politician, he's from the AfD party in Germany, and some pretty influential Russian figures. Krah tried to downplay it, saying he was just a private thing with some old friends, but Leister found some interesting links.
What makes this meeting so important?
Okay, so it turns out other AfD politicians, they were in Sochi too at the same time. They were meeting with, get this, Putin's spokesperson, Dmitry Medvedev, and the whole trip, organized by the same people Krah met with privately.
So maybe it was a little more than just catching up with old friends.
Yeah, it definitely makes you think, right? It raises questions about, the real nature of these, these interactions. What are the AfD's ties to Russia? Leister's findings suggest there's more to it, something that needs more looking into.
It's amazing how these threads, you look at them separately and they seem unrelated, but then they start to show a bigger picture, like a reminder that things happening thousands of miles away can have ripple effects right here at home.
Absolutely. And speaking of things hitting closer to home, I think it's time to shift gears, focus on some power plays happening right here in the U.S. There's a lot to unpack there, wouldn't you say?
I think that might be an understatement. From potentially shady financial dealings to, straight up power grabs, American politics, well, it never fails to deliver.
It's like we're watching some political thriller, right? New twists and turns every day.
So let's start with this thread from Judd Legum. He's an investigative journalist, and he's uncovered something I think potentially explosive. It's a connection between Justin Sun, he's a Chinese national, and he's facing SEC fraud charges, and you guessed it, Donald Trump. It seems Sun transferred a mind-blowing $18 million to Trump.
And it's how he did it that's so interesting. Sun bought these tokens from a crypto company, but guess what? Trump backed that company.
So not a direct transfer, but more like funneling money to Trump. What's the reason for that?
Well, Legum, he thinks, this could be a play for future favors. Maybe hoping those fraud charges against him, poof, they disappear once Trump's back in office.
Talk about a bold move. And the irony, right? Everyone's talking about Sun buying that banana for $6.2 million, the art piece. But this huge, potentially way more significant transaction, it just flew under the radar.
It shows how easily we get distracted by, the flashy stuff and miss the real story.
Makes you wonder what else we're missing. Speaking of missing the bigger picture, David Pepper, he's the former chair of the Ohio Democratic Party. He has this thread documenting, it's about power grabs by the GOP-controlled legislature in North Carolina.
It is concerning, to say the least. Pepper details how they basically enacted measures to weaken the power of newly elected Democratic officials.
They're saying, hey, you might have won, but we're still running the show. What did they do exactly?
Okay, so they took control of the Board of Elections, stripped power from the governor and the attorney general, even, weakened the superintendent of public instruction.
Wow, so it's a systematic attempt to, dismantle Democratic power, and it's not just in North Carolina.
No, right. We're seeing this across the country. It's election denialism in action.
I mean, they're not outright denying the results, but they are finding ways to go around the voters,
It is a subtle form of voter suppression. It's a wake-up call. For anyone who cares about the integrity of our elections. We need to see these tactics for what they are and fight to protect our democracy.
So from shady dealings in, the crypto world to power grabs in state legislatures, American politics, it's getting, kind of treacherous.
The stakes are high, no doubt. And doing nothing, the consequences could be really bad.
And speaking of really bad consequences, let's look at Michael Harriot's thread. It's about Roger Golubsky, a police officer in Kansas City. Some have called him the most corrupt cop in history.
This case, it's disturbing. Harriot, he's a journalist and cultural critic, and he's been on this Golubsky scandal for years.
So what did Golubsky do?
He's accused of, get this, running a sex trafficking and drug cartel and forcing black women into false testimony. And some even say he might be linked to unsolved murders. He evaded justice for decades. But then just before his trial, he committed suicide.
That's, well, a tragic end to a horrific story. But like Harriet points out, this isn't over. There are so many questions.
Right. What about the others? The other officers, prosecutors, judges even, who were involved, and the victims, the countless lives he destroyed. They deserve justice, accountability, everything.
It's crazy how this case flew under the radar, you know? It didn't get much attention from mainstream media.
It shows, I think, how important independent journalism is. We need to hold those in power accountable, even when they're wearing a badge, right? Stories like this, they can't be ignored.
It's a reminder that even our institutions, they can be corrupt, you know? These stories, they expose the dark side of power and remind us that the fight for justice, well, it's never really over.
Can't become complacent. We have to keep fighting for a more just and equitable world. But I think it's time we move on, maybe. The next section, it goes into an even darker trend that seems to be, well, growing all over the world.
That sounds, well, a little ominous. But I have to admit, I'm intrigued. What are we about to uncover?
We're going to look at, well, the erosion of truth and the rise of fascism. It's something that's becoming, I think, increasingly alarming, not just in America, but globally. Get ready, because this is where things get really heavy.
This next section, I gotta say, it's a bit unsettling. We've been talking about power grabs and corruption, but this feels different, almost like, I don't know, like we're in some dystopian novel and truth itself is like falling apart.
Yeah, it's a trend we should be paying attention to, that's for sure. And there's this Twitter thread by Simsalamaya, a German activist and commentator, and they really capture how chilling this all is. It's a deliberate attack, on the free press, on academia, those pillars of a free and informed society.
It makes sense in a twisted way, right? If you want to control the narrative, you attack those two. Without a free press to hold those in power accountable, and without academia, to encourage critical thinking and research, well, it becomes way easier to manipulate people.
Exactly. And Simsalamaya, they make these chilling comparisons to historical examples of fascist regimes. Remember the Nazi Volksempfänger radio, a tool, literally, to spread propaganda.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that history can repeat itself, especially if we don't see the warning signs.
Like they're trying to rewrite reality to fit their agenda and attacking the free press and academia. That's how they do it.
It's a classic tactic, and sadly, it seems to be working. Simsalamaya points to, people like J.D. Vance. He's a big name in the new administration, and he's openly calling professors enemies.
And we can't forget about Elon Musk, right? His whole thing against what he calls the woke mind virus attacking universities. He's even talked about getting rid of the whole system.
Exactly. And these aren't just, isolated incidents. They're part of this bigger pattern, delegitimizing any institution that promotes critical thinking, anything that challenges the people in power. It's about controlling the story and making it really hard to know what's true and what's not.
And with so much information these days, online and everywhere, it's so easy to get caught up in misinformation, in propaganda.
Which is why, developing critical thinking skills, media literacy, that's more important now than ever. We need to be able to evaluate sources, see the bias, and really question, the narratives we're presented with.
We can't just passively consume information anymore, right? We have to be active in figuring out what's true. And speaking of, shaping narratives, Steve Bannon, from the Trump movement, he's never been quiet about his use of propaganda.
He's admitted, straight up, that Trump wouldn't have won without him. And he's made it clear he's not going anywhere. He plans to stay a major player for years to come. Which, when you think about his tactics, that's scary.
Especially when you think about some of the things Trump has said about, wanting to use the FBI against the media, against his political opponents. And then there's, the possibility of Kash Patel, he's close to Bannon, being nominated to lead the FBI. It's like they're setting the stage for, an attack on democracy itself.
And it's not just happening here. Simsalamaya points out this erosion of truth, this rise of illiberalism. It's global. Fueled by fear, by anger, by, I think, disillusionment with, how things are.
It's like a virus, right? Spreading across borders, creating the perfect conditions for these strongmen, the ones who promise simple solutions to, really complex problems.
And those solutions often come at a high price, loss of freedom, suppression of anyone who disagrees, the dismantling of democratic institutions.
Yep.
And it's all happening so fast.
It's a grim picture, but we can't afford to ignore it. We have to recognize the threats and be ready to fight back. Speaking of threats to democracy, Dr. Nafeez Ahmed, he's a scholar and author, has a thread that goes into the global implications of something called Project 2025.
It's basically a blueprint for, reshaping American governance.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not good. Ahmed, he actually predicted this rise of the far right 15 years ago, and now, well, it's happening. He says Project 2025, that's just the beginning.
So what is Project 2025? Who's behind it?
It's an initiative from the Heritage Foundation. They're a conservative think tank, and it outlines this plan to completely overhaul American governance. The goal is to, dismantle the administrative state and give more power to the executive branch. Ahmed points to, figures like Stephen Miller, Tom Hallman, Russell Vought, Brendan Carr, and John Ratcliffe. They're key players in this movement.
Those names, yeah, they've been associated with some, let's say, extreme policies and rhetoric before. What are their roles in this Project 2025?
They're the architects, basically. They've been strategically placed to these key positions to, influence policy and push their agenda forward. Ahmed argues that Project 2025, it's being used as a model for similar efforts globally. And the Heritage Foundation, they have deep ties to, get this, the Atlas Network.
The Atlas Network, what's up?
Okay, so it's a network, a global one, of these conservative think tanks and advocacy groups. And they're funded by, some of the wealthiest, most powerful people in the world. Think of it as this coordinated effort to promote, free market ideology and push back against government regulation.
So it's not just an American thing, it's a worldwide movement with the potential to undermine, democratic institutions and norms everywhere.
Exactly. Ahmed calls this the alt-right, which, I think that's a pretty fitting name. He says it's a dangerous new form of fascism, and it's spreading fast through our political systems, our economic systems, our cultures.
That's a serious warning, one we should definitely pay attention to. We need to understand what's happening, what we're up against, and be ready to resist. Speaking of resistance, Naja72638243, she's a German activist and researcher, has these two threads that they offer this really interesting look into German-Russian relations, how complex they are. They raise some thought-provoking questions about how societies can be resilient against authoritarianism.
Yeah, good point.
What kind of questions?
Well, in the first thread, it questions whether Germany should continue with, Russian language education, cultural exchange programs, all that, given what's happening in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. It's a tough one, right? Because on the one hand, you want to keep those cultural ties, promote understanding. But on the other hand, you can't just ignore, Russia's aggression.
It's a tough balance. You don't want to punish everyday people for their government's actions, but you got to take a stand against, aggression and human rights abuses.
Right. It makes you think, how can societies deal with this, these complex situations and stay true to democratic values when there are these external threats?
What about Naja72638243's second thread?
Okay, so that one, it gets into this potential deal, one that could really change things between Germany and Russia. Yeah. It's about the possible sale of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and the buyer, an American investor, but get this, with ties to both Russia and Trump.
Now, this is getting interesting. What's the deal with this investor?
Naja72638243. She lays out this whole web of connections, and it leads back to people like Matthias Warnick. He's very close to Putin. And this investor, they had a history, let's say, of controversial deals. And they're linked to people who, they helped facilitate communication between Putin and, guess who? U.S. officials.
It's like a spy movie or something, all these backroom deals and shadowy figures.
It definitely raises questions, right? About influence, maybe undue influence, and how the lines are blurred between business and national security.
What about the former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder? He's been, pretty vocal in his support for Putin. He's even taken on roles in, Russian energy companies.
Naja72638243. She points to his role at T-Online Store, and that company was behind a smear campaign, get this, against the German Green Party during the 2021 election.
Wow. Disinformation and political manipulation, it can take so many forms. And it's not always easy to find the source.
Absolutely. Makes you wonder about Olaf Scholz, the current German chancellor. What's his role in all of this?
This is definitely a story that's still developing and one we'll be watching closely. We've covered a lot in this deep dive, from the fragility of democracy with authoritarianism on the rise to global power dynamics and how complex they are. It's been a bit heavy, don't you think?
It has been a lot to process, that's for sure. So what about our listeners? What can they take away from this deep dive, this look into, all these things shaping our world?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? What do we do with all this information, all these glimpses into what's going on?
It comes down to this, I think. Critical thinking. It's not optional anymore, it's essential. We're constantly bombarded with information coming from everywhere, and so much of it is, designed to manipulate us, to divide us. To deal with that, we have to, We have to question everything.
Don't just accept the narratives, right? Look for the agendas, the biases, the missing pieces. Don't be afraid to challenge those in power, especially when they're trying to, I don't know, silence people, control the information.
And remember, those things, they might seem unconnected, right? Like a minimum wage hike in California, a secret meeting in Sochi, a tweet about a corrupt cop. But they might be, well, threads in a much larger story.
Yeah.
It's up to us to see those connections, to see the bigger picture.
That's what this deep dive has been about, right? Exploring the forces shaping our world, the rise of authoritarianism, truth being eroded, global power struggles, the fight for, well, for a just and equitable world.
It's been a journey, for sure, through some, let's say, difficult territory. But I hope, it's left you feeling more informed, more ready to get involved, more empowered to, well, to make a difference.
Because in the end, it comes down to us, our ability to think critically, to see the connections, to, I don't know, to challenge the status quo. Those are the tools we need to build a better world.
Keep asking questions, keep digging, keep connecting those dots. The truth is out there, waiting to be discovered.
And until next time, remember, the deep dive never ends.